Welcome to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel, and today we're going to be talking about the non-archetypal support for the Psy-Frame deck. So, with the exception of this, you will not see any Psy-Frame cards here, only additional cards that make sense to play in the deck. Firstly, we have hand traps. Now, it is a deck entirely of hand traps, meaning Max C is exceptionally good in this deck, especially if you're going second, because you actually can draw into other hand traps, that being other Psy-Frame cards, or even something like Ghost Ogre, Snow Rabbit, or Ash Blossom. Now, Ghost Ogre is pretty neat because it's a psychic, meaning you can play Emergency Teleport in your deck to put it onto the field if you have it set, to give an additional way to disrupt your opponent's play. Additionally, Emergency Teleport is a nice card for allowing you to do special synchro plays in the middle of the battle phase while you have Psy-Frame Circuit on the field. If you already have a Psy-Frame Zeta, and you Emergency Teleport a Alpha or Beta, you can trigger the field spell, allowing you to synchro your Psy-Frame Zeta with your level 1 tuner that was summoned from Emergency Teleport, or a similar card we'll talk about in just a minute, to upgrade and synchro into either Psy-Frame Lord Omega or even a Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon. Technically, any level 8 synchro you can use with just a Psy-Frame Zeta and a level 1 tuner. You can also use Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. Now, the benefit of playing additional hand traps in your Psy-Frame deck is your opponent will assume that the moment you've played your first Psy-Frame, that there are no more hand traps coming. They don't expect you to play additional cards while you have monsters on the field. Playing a few of these is always pretty useful. Now, these are once per turn, so they have a similar limitation to the Psy-Frame cards themselves, but they're still absolutely worth playing. Next, your Psy-Frame deck, you'll notice, doesn't actually do anything unless your opponent does something. So it's good to play some cards that allow you to play on your turn. The most commonly played one is Psychic Field Zone. Psychic Field Zone says, select 2 of your remove from play monsters, or banish monsters, 1 Psychic Tuner and 1 non-Psychic Tuner. Return them to the graveyard and special summon 1 Psychic type Synchro monster from your extra deck in face-up defense position, whose level equals the total level of the return monsters. Now, since every time you negate a card or respond with a Psy-Frame, you'll banish a driver and a level 1 or level 2 tuner, you can always use this to special summon your Zeta or your Omega on your turn, which is especially useful if you did not have access to the field spell when you performed your negation. Something that you can also do is if your Zeta gets banished, level 7 Synchro monster, in addition to a level 2 tuner like a Gamma or a Delta or Epsilon, you can also use this to special summon Psychic type Synchro monsters that you couldn't normally summon, such as Overmind Archfiend. Now, Overmind Archfiend's a level 9, and it also normally requires 2 Psychics tuners. No one's ever going to make this card the normal way. I suppose you could in this deck with the card I'll talk about in a minute. This card is a pretty interesting one. You can banish Psychics from your graveyard, and when it's destroyed, you can special summon all the Psychics banished by this card. So this is a way to get some of your Psychics back into the field. I've never actually played this card, but it does have some pretty impressive stats. Is summonable with this card. Now, this is not considered a synchro summon, so if a card was banished for the effect of Overmind Archfiend, you couldn't special summon it back who were summoned with Psychic Field Zone because it's not a synchro summon. Although, usually you don't really care if your Psy-Frame monsters were synchro summoned or special summoned by Psychic Field Zone. Other things you can do, similar card to perform special summons of synchros that you wouldn't normally do, would be King's Consonance. I know this isn't a card you use on your turn, but if your opponent declares a direct attack, you can banish cards from your graveyard to perform a synchro summon of a level 8 or lower synchro monster. Now, this is also not a synchro summon, and it's a special summon, so you can special summon... Oh, this actually is treated as a synchro summon, but you can special summon things like Crystal Wing without having to go into a synchro first. So this is pretty cool, because this isn't a regular synchro summon. Another thing that most people play when they're playing a pure Psy-Frame deck is Card D, because on your turn, all you really want to do is get to your field spell and fill your hand with as many hand traps as possible. Card D is very good at doing that. There are some problems with Card D, and personally I don't play it, but you can trigger it during your main phase, so you can set all your traps. You can't special summon. It can't be special summoned. So yeah, if you activate this effect, you can't special summon, which means if you were to use it in your end phase, your opponent can do all kinds of cards to you, and you can't respond with any of your Psy-Frames. So they can Twin Twister all of your set cards, so Card D can backfire. I much prefer KURIBANDIT. KURIBANDIT can attack the turn it's summoned, and it tributes itself in the end phase, clearing your field, just like Card D does. You mill the top 5 cards of your deck, and you can add 1 spell or trap card from those 5 to your hand, including a Twin Twister, which you could then activate during that turn. It also allows you to get your Psy-Frames into the graveyard if you want to play Telekinetic Powerwell, which I'll show in a moment. And you can also use this to get your trap card into the graveyard to add whatever card you want from your deck to your hand, which is also pretty cool. It has another use. You can also use it to get your Psy-Frame Multi-Threader into the graveyard, allowing your Telekinetic Powerwell and Emergency Teleport to be useful. So if you were to mill a multi-threader and you added E-Tele or Telekinetic Powerwell to your hand, you can activate them in your end phase while you have the field spell up, and you can use them to synchro summon during the end phase, because they are quick play, so you can play them in the end phase. I couldn't get an English version of Telekinetic Powerwell with decent resolution, so what it says is you can activate this card and you can target level 1 and 2 psychic type monsters in your graveyard and special summon as many of them as you want, and you pay 300 life points times the levels of the monsters summoned. So you can use this to summon multiple monsters, which actually lets you make some pretty interesting synchros. Like in my build, I play the Red Dragon Archfiend series, so STARLIGHT, Hot Red Dragon Archfiend, Abyss, and Bane. So you can do some pretty neat stuff with this card, although it's not quite as good as Emergency Teleport, just because you're not as likely to get Psy-Frames into your graveyard unless you're playing KURIBANDIT or a stranger version, because most Psy-Frames are just going to get banished by their own effects. Soul Charge is also a playable card in here, which is pretty good because it's pretty good in most synchro decks, and because your synchros can leave the field to clear your extra zone, it's pretty good, but it is a lot of life points to pay, so I don't use it, but other people have. Other cards you can play on your turn include Time Lords, because they play defense for you, and you normally have an open field to normal summon them without tributing, and then they just return to your deck during your standby phase, allowing you to continue to play if you have cards you want to play. So Time Lord's pretty cool. And recently we got a mini draw engine in the form of the spellbooks. So if you play the spellbooks, you can use your normal summon, which you probably wouldn't be using otherwise, on Spellbook Magician of Prophecy, and you can add Spellbook of Secrets to your hand, and then search your deck for Spellbook of Knowledge, and then send him to the graveyard to draw 2 cards. So pretty neat things we can do with the Spellbook engine. Now, because we don't really do any kind of summoning on our turn, Pot of Duality is a particularly useful draw card as well. You can look at the top 3 cards and pick whatever you need, whether it be your field spell or your trap card, or you could do something silly like pass up on the trap card to take a Pot of Desires, because it could even be a trap card. So that would be kind of a funny thing to have happen. But yeah, the other problem with Pot of Duality is just like with Card D. If you activate it, you can't special summon. So if your opponent has traps or monster effects they wanted to activate, suddenly you're at risk of those going off on you. So you don't really want to use this unless your deck kind of is made to use it. And the builds I use aren't, but it's very popular in most Psy-Frame builds. Next is Pot of Desires, which works particularly well with Psy-Frame Lord Omega, because he can unbanish your banished face-down cards. So you banish the top 10 cards of your deck and add 2 potential hand traps to your hand, or other cards. And then your Omegas can give you some access to them. And there's some pretty good cards that you can return to the graveyard that way. One last card, which I haven't actually tested in Psy-Frames too much, but it might be useful, is Pot of Acquisitiveness. You can use it to return your drivers to the deck if they all get banished, and draw a card. So it replaces itself, but is a dead draw early game. But because all of your Psy-Frames get banished on their own, the odds of using this to get some card back isn't that low. Additionally, it's a good tech against ABC, which is a popular deck at the moment, but it may not be in the future. If they try to tag out their ABC Buster, you can shuffle the pieces back into their deck, preventing them from summoning anything. Another thing you can do with this is if you have Psy-Frame Omega or Zeta banish monsters from your opponent, you can shuffle those back into their deck. So you'll get your monsters back, because the Omega and Zeta can come back even if the cards that they had taken from the field do get removed from the banish zone. And just another card, I haven't really used this, but I'm sure I've seen other people use it. Psychic Overload, target 3 psychics in your graveyard and shuffle all 3 into your deck and then draw 2 cards. So it's kind of a good way to reload. Personally, I don't play this, but I've seen it used by a couple of people. It's definitely not a high count play card if you do use it. It works a little better if you play KURIBANDIT or have other ways to get psychics into your graveyard. But yeah, when Konami releases new archetypes, they tend to make it so that they work well with certain previously released cards. So the Feel Zone seems to have been the ideal card designed to use with the Psy-Frames, even though it was released much earlier. This card, I think, has a similar look. There's also other cards I didn't mention, just because they're kind of obvious, like Psychic Path, where you can add 2 banished psychics from your banish zone to your hand. That's also playable if you need to get back your drivers at the cost of 800 life points. Let's move on. We're going to take a look at some search cards. The most obvious search card would be Terraforming. You can use that to get your field spell. And soon we're getting a new field spell playing card, METAVERSE. METAVERSE can let you either activate a field spell from your deck or add one to your hand. Now, the reason METAVERSE is particularly good in Psy-Frames is if you activate a Psy-Frame gear while you only have a set trap, your opponent won't expect you to get a special summon out of it. But if you then chain METAVERSE you can activate Psy-Frame Psy-Frame Circuit and get it to resolve during that chain, so it'll be face up on the field when you resolve the effect of your Psy-Frame. So at the resolution of that chain, you'll be able to trigger the field spell to Synchro Summon. There are some other kinds of cards that are sort of search cards, but they're also not sort of search cards. Foolish Burial of Goods is a very good one. You can send any spell or trap from your deck to the graveyard, perform a search, like your Psy-Frame Overload can perform a search. You could play Rise to Full Height. There's a loop with this card where you can make it so your opponent can only attack your Omega, and then Omega can leave the field, making it impossible for your opponent to attack at all. You can also do a similar combo with, what's that card? Spiritual Swords of Revealing Light, and this is also particularly good with like Breakthrough Skill. You can get a Breakthrough Skill into the graveyard because that's a card that you can't negate with Totally Awesome and things of that nature, so there are some reasons to play those cards as well. You can also play Foolish Burial if you want to put into the graveyard either Psy-Frame Multi-Threader, if you wanted to use its effect with Emergency Teleport. Now personally, I play a Glow Up Bulb in my deck because whenever I Synchro Summon my Psy-Frame Zeta, I like to be able to normal summon something and Synchro with it so I can get the Zeta into the graveyard to recover a Psy-Frame card, and it just gives me more plays. You can also use Zeta and Bulb to make a Crystal Wing, which is pretty cool. Now I didn't mention when we were talking about hand traps that Effect Veiler is actually also okay in the deck, mostly because it's a level 1 tuner that can go with your Zetas. Let's move on. We're going to take a look at, oh yeah, I forgot I had the Paleozoic Marrella here. It's what I was using before Foolish Burial of Goods came out. It's a little slower because you can't even use it till your next turn. So when you do send your Overload to the graveyard, you can't use it to get back the, you can't use it to search a Psy-Frame until your turn. So not as good, but there are some hybrid decks where you can play a Psy-Frame Paleozoic deck, so you might play this card in there. Let's take a look at the Synchros you can play. Starlight Road would be a good side deck card if you play something like Stardust Dragon. Now Stardust Dragon is a level 8, so you can make it with Gamma and Delta. You can also use Stardust's effect to remove him from the field, allowing you to make more Synchro Summons without actually making any Link monsters, which is partially my favorite thing about Psy-Frames at the moment, that most of their monsters actually exit the extra zone, so that's pretty cool. You can also make Scrap Dragon, which can make any of your cards essentially bullets, and you can destroy cards on your opponent's side of the field, including himself if he's occupying a space you don't want to use. You can make Crystal Wing, like I mentioned, with Zeta and any level 1 tuner you're willing to add to your deck. Now, a lot of Psy-Frame decks don't play any of those more interesting tech cards, which kind of limits them to what they can actually do. So they kind of have a predictable play, but this is a nice card to add. You can also play Yazi, Evil of the Yang-Zing, just to use him as a level 7 Scrap Dragon to plop a card just to get him off the field so you can play more Psy-Frames. Seen that in a couple of builds, it's pretty neat. Probably the most commonly played non-Psy-Frame Synchro in the Psy-Frame deck is Black Rose Dragon. When this card is Synchro Summoned, you can destroy all cards on the field. Now if you play Multi-Threader, you can prevent your face-up trap card or your spell card from being destroyed, which is pretty cool. The only issue with Black Rose Dragon is if you special summon it as Chain Link 2 or higher, it actually will not trigger because its effect occurs when it is summoned, and if something else resolves as Chain Link 1, it won't come out. So if it's your opponent's turn and they have a card that triggers as Chain Link 1 when your Psy-Frame Circuit triggers, you might actually want to go into Zeta instead to avoid this fizzling and becoming useless. Let's move on and take a look at some more stuff. Ancient Fairy Dragon's going to be really popular soon, especially since your opponents are going to be making their own field spells and using their own Ancient Fairy Dragons, but you can pop their field spell to search your field spell. Additionally, Ancient Fairy Dragon can be used to special summon your Psy-Frame tuners from your hand, and they can't be normal summoned or set or special summoned by game mechanics, so they have to be special summoned by a card effect. You can't pendulum summon a Psy-Frame tuner, which I did try to make a deck to do, which was pretty much a miserable fail. But you know, everybody has to try everything. But if you can make a Ancient Fairy Dragon, you can potentially search a field spell, make things like Solemn Strike live again if your life was too low. You can also use it to special summon an Alpha or a Beta from your hand and then make a Crystal Wing or a Omega, and it's pretty neat to have other level 7s you can play besides a Black Rose Dragon or Zeta. Another one that I was experimenting with slightly is Vermillion Dragon Mech. who's pretty cool. If you have an Omega already on the field and you play a level 1 tuner, you can synchro summon into Vermillion Dragon Mech. Its effect is you can banish one tuner from your hand or field or graveyard to target one card on the field and destroy it. And if this is destroyed by a card effect, you can add one of your tuners back to your hand. So you can essentially add any of your banished Psy-Frames back to your hand when he dies, but it doesn't activate when he's destroyed by battle, so you do have to be a little careful about that. But it is nice to have more things you can make. Its additional benefit is that it only requires 2 monsters to make, and that would be the only way you would be synchro summoning it. Unlike a level 9 like a Trishula or the Overmind Archfiend, you're not really going to get into it by using 3 monsters. So it's neat that you can use this. Also works well if you play Veilers and things of that nature. Now, because you don't really keep things on board wipes are useful. Additionally, you might want to board wipe yourself. So Darkhold might actually be better than Raigeki in Psy-Frames, because you can nuke your board, allowing you to play Psy-Frames. So imagine your opponent has a bunch of floaters on the field and you have Gammas in hand. If you Dark Hole, their floaters will activate and you can negate them with Gamma, which is pretty cool. Torrential Tribute is essentially the same thing, but it could be a little more disruptive to your opponent, so you might want to do that on your opponent's turn. Other cards you could play would be like Drowning Mirror Force, since you don't really keep monsters on board. That's a pretty good way to wipe your board of your opponent's cards. A new card that's coming out, I think it's going to be called, I forgot the name, Evenly Matched, but it was referred to as Struggling Battle for a while. This will be out in Circuit Break. Because you don't really put cards on board other than your field spell, if you don't have a field spell on board, you can just proceed to the end of the battle phase and banish the entire board and then start playing all of your cards. So this is a good card that we're going to be testing, probably going second, when you know for sure you won't have your spell on the field, because you don't really want to have this if you have your spell. But it's an interesting card to test, and I haven't tested it yet, but I'm sure a lot of people have, and I've heard mixed reactions. Mostly that it's better going second, and it's not good if you draw it late, so there are some issues with this card. I was also testing Needle Sealing, just to mention, because you do put a card on the board out of nowhere. Now, there aren't really a lot of ways to deal with trap cards in the Psy-Frame deck, because your Psy-Frame Epsilon doesn't do much, so you have to play more traditional back row removal. A good one that I like to play is Night Beam. Now, Night Beam's good because you can use it to target your opponent's Dimensional Barrier, and if you hit Dimensional Barrier will get destroyed and they won't be able to prevent you from synchro summoning, which is a big deal for this deck. Now, it is possible for people to play around Night Beam by activating a secondary card and then activating Dimensional Barrier. Now, the other feature of Night Beam that's pretty cool is it's a 1-for-2 in that sense. Your opponent still has to activate another card just to activate their other card, so this avoids you having to discard a card. You could even get away with just playing Heavy Dust Storm and destroy 2, but the other reason I like this card is it forces your opponent to do these goofy plays, meaning that if you do play Psy-Frame Epsilon or side in Psy-Frame Epsilon, you can force them to activate a trap card, or 2 trap cards even, by using this. So if you were to hit a face down Dimensional Barrier, your opponent might activate like a Twin Twister, which you can then respond with a Delta, and then they could respond with Dimensional Barrier, and then you can respond with Epsilon. So this is a way to get Epsilon into play. So I think it's pretty neat. It's also good for dealing with things like counter traps that you don't want to deal with on the fly, and that's the other issue with Psy-Frame Epsilon. The best traps in the game are all counter traps or mirror forces, and neither of which work with Epsilon, because if it's a mirror force, you have to be attacking, which means you have monsters on board, and if it's a counter trap, you just can't respond to it with Epsilon. So Epsilon is better, once again, when your opponent shotguns traps, or it's good against D-Barrier if you can force the activation of D-Barrier, but you don't really want to have to target it with an MST and it just get activated and then you waste cards. So Night Beam is particularly good for this. Also, I would have recommended a Wiretap or something of that nature. Now, Psy-Frame decks lack offense because unless you get a Synchro monster on board, you can't really do anything. So one thing that's been done is people have been trying Wind-Up Rabbit, which you can search using a Fire Formation Tenki, so you don't have to play as many dead cards in your deck while deck thinning. And Wind-Up Rabbit can just push for damage while removing itself from the field to make your Psy-Frames live again. Other players have tested Yosenjus, which essentially do the same thing. Your Yosenju, 3 can search additional Yosenjus, and you can just apply a lot of pressure while your opponent doesn't do much. And once again, since they leave the board, it lets your Drowning Mirror Forces do quite a bit of work. So that's pretty cool to use Yosenjus with that method of pushing for damage. Another build that I haven't tested too much is a Paleozoic Psy-Frame deck, and the goal being that you use Swap Frog to push for damage and bounce them back to your hand. And once you get enough frogs that you can put out a Totally Awesome, you can have Toad act as a Psy-Frame, so it can negate something and recover your Swap Frog or itself. So your opponent will activate a card, and then you can negate with Totally Awesome, recover a card, and then your Psy-Frames are live again. The only problem with playing this particular build is you don't really want to activate the effect of Totally Awesome to special any Toads from your deck, unless the scenario suggests that you should, just because then you can't clear your board to use your Psy-Frames. So Totally Awesome and Swap Frog is very good for pushing for damage. Now personally I play a zombie build, because SHIRANUI Solitaire is a 1-card Psy-Frame Lord Omega, plus it gives you a lot of things to discard if your opponent thinks that the only way to beat your deck is to just pass and do nothing. Because this actually gives you a tremendous amount of cards you can discard into the graveyard, like Mizuki and things like that, giving you additional plays and things you can do with that. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to discuss. And stay tuned for the next episode where we go into different deck designs, and I'll see you next time.